Hey friends, and welcome back to our series on studying effectively for GCSEs and A-levels. In this video I will be going through the process by which I learnt new content in a chronological order, as well as including an example. As always, timestamps will be in the description down below, so do check those out during the video. So for most of you, the first time you will learn about a new piece of content will be during class, and the most natural thing to do is to take notes during the lesson. Now, whilst taking notes during a lesson is good because it helps you pay attention and gives you something to reference later, I find that many people take this to extreme and are writing almost everything the teacher is saying throughout the lesson. Now, I think there are a few issues with writing continuously throughout the lesson. The main issue I find is that by writing throughout the lesson, you end up focusing too much on the process of writing and can get quite anxious if you aren't keeping up with the speed of the teacher. Instead, we should be focusing on the content itself and not the process of writing down content. Our aim when learning about something for the very first time should be to first understand the material, and especially when the teacher is presenting it, because you can ask them questions during the lesson, and only after we understand the material should we focus on remembering it. So personally, what I do during lessons is that I pay attention and listen to the teacher for about 5 to 10 minutes, and when they take a pause or finish explaining a concept or an idea, then I will jot down a few notes and draw some sketches explaining the same concept. I found that alternating between periods of writing and periods of just paying attention allowed me not to get caught up in trying to copy down everything that was being said, but actually allowed me to focus on first understanding the material being presented rather than just writing it all down. Now, since we should focus on understanding, and as we will be using digital flashcards and notes, as you will see later in the series, I don't concern myself with being too neat. I think that trying to be neat and switching between different coloured pens or highlighters is just a distraction from the whole process of understanding. I think that different coloured highlighters are only useful when drawing complicated diagrams or marking work. And on that note, diagrams are especially important because for subjects like maths and science, you can summarise a lot of information into just a few good diagrams. Ultimately, this meant that most of my time in class was spent on understanding the material and asking questions, and a small amount of time was actually spent on making bullet points of the information being presented in my own words. I didn't worry too much about trying to get every little detail down during the lesson. Instead, I focused on getting the overall idea of what was going on in the topic. As you will see later in the video, we focused on smaller details later after we built up a bigger picture. I then repeated this process for every lesson during the week and made an effort to understand the content presented in each lesson. After a few lessons, when a subject teacher had finished teaching a topic, or a large enough chunk of a topic, I usually had a big picture of what was going on in the topic, and this meant that I could now focus on the smaller details. So these are some of my class notes from A-level chemistry, and as you can see, we were learning about the topic of phenol and its reactions in class. This is a topic from the second year of A-level chemistry, so don't worry if you haven't seen this before, I'm just using it as an example here. Now, if I were to add some extra information onto these notes and perhaps rephrase some things, then this piece of paper is going to get pretty cluttered. Besides, there's no point in doing any of that if I'm not going to then later test myself on the material to make use of active recall. The goal here is to add any extra information that we want to onto these notes and then turn them into flashcards so we can make use of active recall, which, as we've established in earlier videos, is one of the most powerful learning techniques. Then we will import these flashcards into a program called Anki, which will help us make use of the other effective learning technique, which is spaced repetition. So let's switch over to computer to see how this is done. Now, I created a folder for the subjects on my Google Drive, and I saved the specification into this folder as well. So if I look at the specification, I can see that I have 6 modules for chemistry, and I have made a folder for each of these modules. So if I look up where the topic of phenols is by doing Control F and then search phenol, you can see it's in module 6, Organic Chemistry and Analysis, and is in section 6.1, Aromatic Compounds, Carbonyls and Acids. So if I then go into module 6 and I create a new document, and I'll call this document Flashcards. So after creating this Flashcards document, what I do is I write out the modules. So you can see I have 6.1 aromatic compounds, carbonyls and acids. So just add a dash in here and turn this into a heading 1. And then I use a submodule as well. So I have the submodule 6.1.1 aromatic compounds. So if I just paste this here and turn that into a heading 2. And if I just repeat this for everything else from the specification under this module, so after writing out all the submodules and sub-submodules, I check where phenol is on the specification, and you can see if I scroll up, it fits under 6.1.1 aromatic compounds. So underneath aromatic compounds, what I like to do is I insert a table, 2 columns, any number of rows, because we can always add more rows later. And then I make the first column about 1/3 of the length and the second column about 2/3. And then I just paste this table underneath for the rest of the headings. What I do now is I type up my notes from class under 6.1.1 aromatic compounds, whilst adding more rows to this table if needs be. I make sure each row is roughly split by concept, and I bullet point my notes from class into a right-hand column. This process is quite nice because it gives me a chance to review the information that I learned from class as I type it up. If there are any diagrams that I need to use, then I find an image of something similar off Google Images, and I copy it into here. Or I would take a picture of the diagram on my phone, upload it to Google Drive using the app on my phone, and then import it into the notes. After I finish the process of typing up all these notes, I'll make any corrections to any spelling mistakes, and then also change the font to Proxima Nova because I prefer that font. Now it's so much easier to add any extra content that I need to these notes, and it gave me a chance to review the material as I was typing it up. So now what I would usually have is a list of sources I can cross-check with, and I would store these on a Kanban board on Notion, which I mentioned in my previous organization video. For example, in chemistry for module 6, I have these sources which I need to use in turn by turn. So I've added to them from class. And do bear in mind that I won't watch all the videos or use all the sources. If I feel pretty confident that I understood something pretty well from class and I've covered all the content, then I generally wouldn't use it and I would just skim watch these videos like on double or triple speed. So now if I look up the first source, which is ChemRevise, then I can find the OCR revision guides on ChemRevise because I'm doing OCR here. And then I would go down to aromatic compounds here. And let's find phenol on here. So these are the phenol notes from ChemRevise. And what I would do is I would just add any extra information onto my notes from these ChemRevise notes. So if I do that now, so now that I finished using these notes to add any extra information that I needed to, which were a few more bullet points, I would go back to the board and then see that I also have to add from my chem guy. So I've added from ChemRevise. So now if I search my chem guy phenol, you can see he has a few videos on phenol. So I'm not going to watch this now, but usually what I would do is I'd watch through this, and I think he has it on his playlist as well. So OCR Module 1, if I go here, then you can see he has 2 videos on phenol and a few others. So usually what I would do is I'd watch this, and if it's covering things too slowly, then I would just speed up the video by going and setting the speed a bit higher, and then make any more notes from the video, which I would then add onto these to make sure I have fully understood everything. And any diagrams that I like, I would screenshot as well and add it onto those notes too. And I think these videos are pretty good at generally helping me understand concepts and ideas that I can then explain into my own words on the notes. So after I've added some information from my chem guy, I would go to the CGP revision guide, and because I have the digital version, I can just log in and access it from here. So you can see this is a phenol section, and it explains more about phenol and a few other things here. And I would basically use this to cross-check any information I had by reading through it. And I would do a similar process for the textbook as well. And the reason I use the CGP revision guide and the textbook as the final checkboxes is because I think the main mistake people make with CGP revision guides is using them to learn the content. They're meant as more of a revision guide, which means they're only useful if you have some understanding or an idea of what the topic is on about. If you open the CGP revision guide without understanding the topic and the big picture, then it's quite easy to get lost in a lot of these bullet points and details and not knowing what's going on. So here I mainly use the CGP revision guide to make sure I've learnt all the content and using it as a reference and getting any images that I find useful from it by screenshotting them. But I would never really put too much effort into using it and place too much emphasis on like the minor details in the revision guide. And as for the digital version of the textbook, I would check that at the end as well to screenshot any more diagrams that I find useful and can add onto my notes. But usually videos and online notes distill the concepts very well. I find that the textbook tends to go all over the place, and in my experience, it wasn't too useful. I would often skim read it and barely add anything onto my notes after that. because a lot of places like the videos and the notes on ChemRevise tended to simplify the information quite well. But unfortunately, most GCSE and A-level students don't know what good textbooks are like, as the only time I think people really put effort into writing the textbook is for university textbooks. So it's quite easy to sell off with something mediocre which isn't too helpful, and using something that ends up causing more issues than it actually solves. Ultimately, remember that if a resource isn't working for you, it isn't your fault provided you're putting some effort into understanding it. So all I can say is that if you find the textbook useful, then use it. If not, don't bother. Personally, I only found it useful for skim reading to make sure I had covered most of the main ideas and for screenshotting any diagrams. So after working through the CGP revision guide and the textbook and adding any extra small things onto my notes, they were pretty much done. So I can check off these 2 boxes. And after writing down all the information from these various resources, now I can combine many of the bullet points together because there may be some duplicate information, and then give the notes a bit more structure, which makes the next step easier, which is the process of turning these notes into flashcards. And during the combining process, when combining any bullet points together, it gives me a chance to actually make sure I have understood all the material and can turn it into a more coherent structure. So then when I learned these later topics as well in class, then I would repeat a similar process and use these notes, these resources that I mentioned on Notion, and obviously uncheck all the boxes and recheck them again for that topic, just to make sure I'm doing the order correctly. Also, I would recommend that you stick to a few good resources such as ChemRevise and MyChemGuy if you're doing OCR chemistry, rather than a lot of poor quality resources. And I would aim for about 3 to 5 because I find any more than that can be overwhelming. And besides, for like any minor detail which is very important and you may have missed somehow because it wasn't in any of these resources, you will encounter it in an exam question after doing some past papers if it's that important, and then you can add that onto your notes as well. So now, using all these resources to review and understand the material, next up is turning these notes into flashcards, because there isn't much point in making notes unless we test ourselves on them using active recall and spaced repetition, and having flashcards in a digital app like Anki is a great way to do both. In case you don't know what Anki is, the following video in the series will explain Anki and the basics of using it. In this video, I will just be turning these notes into flashcards. So usually I like to stick to 1 concept per flashcard and like to ignore any trivial information. By that, I mean if you're doing A-level chemistry, then there's not much point in making a flashcard called what is the relative charge of an electron, because that should be pretty obvious to you at that point if you're doing A-level chemistry. But of course, if you're doing GCSE chemistry and learning it for the first time, then it may not be obvious. And likewise, making a flashcard such as what is phenol when you're first learning about phenol can be helpful, but if you then go on to do chemistry at university, then you don't really need that flashcard anymore because you should know what phenol is by that point. Anyways, try not to worry about getting the level of detail just right in each flashcard. You always have an opportunity to edit and trim down the flashcard each time you review it, and as you do more exam questions and past papers, you get an idea of what sort of things are useful and what sort of things will never come up. My flashcards weren't perfect the first time, and sometimes when I was going through them, then I would edit them and make improvements to phrasing or make it a bit more concise. I think it's much better to make improvements on the fly when you're reviewing the flashcards, whenever you realize something, rather than staring at this document for ages and hoping some improvements or suggestions come to mind. Also, turning the content to flashcards helps me to continue to engage with the material as I think about how to rephrase it into a question. So now that I finished turning my notes to flashcards, I check again with the specification underneath the phenol section to make sure I've covered all the points they want me to know about in my flashcard somewhere. And once I finish checking it, it basically means my flashcards are ready. In the next video, we will be learning about Anki, and in the one after, I will show you how to add these flashcards into Anki and use Anki for reviewing the flashcards and making use of spaced repetition. So this is essentially a process I would repeat every weekend or every other weekend or even on some weekdays, depending on my mood and how ahead or on top I wanted to feel. The process was basically reviewing the material I learned in lesson by making notes on my computer, and then adding onto those notes, and then turning those into flashcards, which I would then consistently use throughout the year. So by the time my end of year exams came around, I basically knew everything I needed to. And it's important to remember that this process does not mean you've learned everything perfectly. Remember that ultimately learning is a gradual process. Reviewing the content and making and going through flashcards and doing practice questions and past papers is all part of the learning process. It's not like you have to first learn something before you do practice questions and past papers on it. Sure, you have to know most of it, but it doesn't mean you have to know everything before you can start doing those questions. It's not like there's some magic off-on switch where at one moment you don't know something and the next moment you've learnt it. And remember that learning can be a difficult process too, so don't be discouraged. You will get stuck a few times, you won't understand the teacher or a video, and your explanation on the flashcard may be unsatisfactory, in which case it can be useful to ask your friends or do some research online or ask in an online form for people to help you. But yeah, that's basically it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one, in which I will talk more about using Anki.